My Lord God, I have no idea where I am going. I do not see the road ahead of me. I cannot know for certain where it will end, nor do I really know myself. And the fact that I think I'm following your will does not mean that I'm actually doing so. But I believe the desire to please you does, in fact, please you. And I hope I have that desire in all that I am doing. I hope that I will never do anything apart from that desire. And I know that if I do this, you will lead me by the right road, though I may know nothing about it. Therefore will I trust you always, though I may seem to be lost and in the shadow of death. I will not fear, for you are ever with me, and you will never leave me to face my perils alone.
Welcome to the Liminal Living Podcast. I'm your curator of conversations, Dr. Tom Rundell. And our podcast exists to explore that liminal space of where the church might be going, where religion, spirituality is going to fit into the lives of this modern world. We're definitely not there yet, and what we've been doing isn't working anymore. So we're in a liminal time, a liminal space. And so we're just exploring around. Some of you experience this liminal space differently than others, which is why we have a lot of different kinds of conversations. Some are theological, some are philosophical, and some are just sharing stories of how they've entered liminal space. Sometimes it appears like a dark night of the soul, a time of suffering you can't make sense of, and your church community, spiritual practice also can't help you make sense of that. Sometimes it's a deconstruction process where the things that you used to hold to, some kind of light has shined on that, and you just no longer can hold on to it. It just doesn't seem quite right anymore. And maybe it worked for a season, and now it doesn't. Sometimes those two go hand in hand. Dark nights and deconstructions often do. And so our podcast is designed specifically to give conversations with different practices, perspectives, and conversations, stories of people in liminal space. And today we talk with a fellow podcaster, Josh Patterson, who runs the Rethinking Faith podcast. Josh has been through the church world, grown up in it, and has since kind of left. And he's been trying to find his home in a podcasting community, a theological community called the Homebrewed Christianity Network. And he's also found some open and relational theologies that help him process God with his current world and how it makes sense. And we had a really good conversation around not just deconstruction, and not just around open relational theology, but around mysticism. I was really surprised that our conversation went this way. I wasn't sure what to expect. I just knew that talking with Josh was going to be a beneficial conversation in some fashion. And we ended up talking a lot about Thomas Merton and the mystics and how the mystical experiences and practices actually helped us hang on to some form of spirituality through the deconstruction process. And we mutually talk about that together, what it looked like in both of our lives, and it was just a really good conversation where we both get a little bit vulnerable. And I hope you enjoy this, and I hope it's helpful. So here is my conversation with Josh Patterson. All right, I just hit the record button, and I'll figure that out as we go.
Sweet.
So, yeah, I got my coffee. I'm fully caffeinated right now.
Nice.
And I haven't had
my
lunch.
Coffee, and I poured myself a small 12-ounce beer, so.
Nice. What's your...
Yeah.
Oh, well, hey, I guess I better... Before I was going to ask you what your favorite beer was, but that's the first question, and I haven't even introduced you yet. So, all right. Well, Josh Patterson, welcome to the Liminal Living Podcast. It's awesome to have you on today.
Yeah, thanks so much for inviting me. I'm excited to be here.
Now, I mean, you have an interesting job that I'm a little bit envious of. You're like you brew beer, right, at a brewery. Is this your job? Like, you brew beer? Is this the dream job you have?
So I was, unfortunately, I guess, share some bad news with you. I was brewing beer professionally for about 3 years until very recently, where I had to step away just purely because of finances. Um, like brewing beer is a really cool job.
Yeah.
And I thought it was a cool job, but my mortgage company didn't care that it was a cool job. They just wanted
Uh,
me to pay my mortgage.
right, right. They do tend to want that. Yeah.
Yeah, so I currently actually am working as a parish administrator at a tiny little Episcopal church here in Maryland. And but recently, so I took that on full time, left brewing to do that, and then recently I was told that my position's being cut to part time, and
Oh
so
man.
that has started. I've done 2 weeks now of part time work there, and actively looking for employment elsewhere. So
Well,
yes.
I am the best of luck to you on the job search. I mean, you got so much experience with church administration and beer brewing, and I'm sure there's lots of stuff in between.
Hmm.
But when you were brewing beer, what was your favorite one that you got to brew?
Yeah, so I really enjoyed. There was a beer that we would make at Full Tilt, which was my favorite brewery that I got to work at. They unfortunately went out of business due to, like COVID type stuff,
Oh yeah.
which, put a hurting on a lot of not just breweries, but all sorts of small local businesses. Um, but their flagship IPA was called Hops the Cat, and it was fantastic. I
Mm.
really loved Hops the Cat. Um, it was great. It was they listed it as like an American IPA, but it was kind of leaned more towards the West Coasty kind of IPA. So it had like a nice, like slightly darker color to it. It was dry, had some nice bite to it. And we would do a variant called Hops the Cat Grapefruit, where we would condition it on organic grapefruit puree, and that was amazing. So
That
that was
sounds
my
good.
favorite to
That
do
was your
was
favorite?
Hops the Cat.
Do they?
Yeah.
And there's nowhere else to get this now. The hoppy grapefruity kitty cat.
Unfortunately not.
Mm.
You could perhaps find beers that are, I mean, you can definitely find IPAs that use grapefruit. But yeah, I mean, although I still know the recipe for it. So maybe I could homebrew some. I'm sure Nick and Dan, the owners, wouldn't mind as long as I shared with them.
I used to for Christmas one year, my father-in-law got me this little plastic keg called the Mr. Beer Kit, and then you buy like
Mhm.
these cans. Uh, they almost look like frosting, cake frosting cans. So you pop them open, and they have like this syrup in there. Then you got to do some stuff with the syrup, and then add, your hops and add your sugars and everything, and then you bottle it. So it was a whole, gosh, I think a 12-week process. But I used to brew my own beer when I had nothing better to do with my life.
Nice.
That was my hobby. I was just like, yeah, what am I gonna do in evenings? I'm just gonna brew some beer. So I have a tiny little experience with brewing kits. That's probably not the same as what you were doing, but it was good. My favorite one was this stout.
Oh,
It was
cool.
a
Okay.
it was a Irish stout made with oatmeal. That was
Oh,
pretty
cool.
good. I would like toast it, and it was it was pretty good. It was almost like a meal because it was so thick.
Right. Yeah, those stouts can be heavy. But yeah, I mean, I think the like beer kits are great. That's how like got into brewing. Was using beer kits at home. And that's called extract brewing would be like the technical term for that. So that can of stuff, basically they did a process called mashing for you, and
Yeah,
then they just condensed that and said, here you go. So they just cut out, some of the beginning steps that require different equipment.
I didn't have
So,
any equipment, just a just a plastic keg with
yep.
a
Right.
little tap on it. Uh,
Yeah, to ferment. Yep.
oh yeah, that was fun. That was the day. Well, you are like a podcaster, a lover of beer, a church administrator. You got like a lot of hats, and you do a lot of conversations around open relational theology, which I enjoy. but like, what kind of soil did your life grow up out of to get you to this place?
Yeah, sure. So I grew up in like at first kind of like a nominally Christian home at best, kind of like Creasters, Christmas and Easter type
Mm.
experience. And, that eventually ended up changing. My parents did this thing called the Walk to Emmaus, which is like an adult retreat that like is connected to the Methodist Church. And that kind of kick-started their faith, so to speak. And then we started going to church a lot. We ended up leaving the Methodist Church to go to the Southern Baptist Church down the road that had the wonders of early 2000s contemporary Christian music.
Oh yeah.
And so that was kind of the attraction there. And that's where I spent a lot of my time. We were there for a while for years. I was in the youth group, very active, this kind of thing. And we were there until my brother, my middle brother, came out as gay when he was in 7th grade. And we were kicked out of that church, literally told, you guys are no longer welcome here.
Mm.
So we left there. I was like still nominally connected with the youth group because I had friends, and this kind of stuff. And so they eventually, my parents, we kind of bounced around and then ended up in like a non-denominational church. That at the time felt a bit more welcoming because, they were open to having gay people present. Now their thoughts about gay people, not so welcoming, but they were at least allowed to be there. So, yeah, that's kind of how that was. But when I was in youth group, they, gave me a microphone and like told me to preach and stuff. So very early on, I was kind of tasked with or, invited to speak and teach and that kind of thing. So I ended up going to college at Messiah, now University, where I started out as a computer science information major and hated it. Fell into my major which I graduated with, which was digital media graphic design, but with a minor in student ministry. And that's what I ended up doing when I graduated college. I became a youth pastor. Well, first I worked for Youth for Christ. I started a campus life club. And then I got hired at my first church, which I was a teaching pastor there. That church was terrible. I can elaborate on that later if you want. I then landed in a Methodist congregation where I was the student pastor, basically. And that church was better, but still had its issues. And then ultimately, I ended up landing in the last church I worked in, where I was the high school and young adult pastor. And I stopped doing that around the beginning of COVID. Is when I kind of stepped away from vocational ministry and became a brewer. So that's kind of a bit of my background and story. I, kind of have a lot of what people are calling like church hurt kind of stuff, especially around LGBTQ stuff. I've seen how that has impacted my family, my friends, and my loved ones. And I learned a lot about the world and people and community and friendship outside of the church when I started working in breweries. So
you have like this pastoral experience. What would have been your understanding of God, and how is it developing as you're going from church to church? I'm sure like some things are shifting as you run into some church hurt over here and it's like, well, this doesn't work. And so how did your understanding of God evolve over your course of your ministry career?
Yeah, so I mean, I very much had, the standard understanding of, or standard, I'll call it like classical theism, the omni-God. God is omnipotent, God is omnipresence. So God knows everything, God is all powerful, God is everywhere, God is timeless, all this kind of stuff. And that was the normal thing for me. And that started to shift a little bit when, with the kind of experiences I started to have in the church when I was like, I don't know, I don't think God um, plans or just allows this kind of bad stuff to happen. So that started to kind of break some things for me. Basically, the problem of evil um, started to break some things, and then when I was in the Methodist church, I learned a lot more about a God who is love. They focused less on the fire and brimstone and the hell stuff and just more on love. That was the first church I worked in where they were open and affirming. So the worship pastor, who is still a very good friend of mine to this day, Chad, is an openly gay man. And so that kind of broke some categories for me, right? And so really started to take this idea of a God who is love seriously. And then ultimately at the final church that I was working at is where I really started to get introduced to diverse theologies, theologies of people who look different than me, who are not white, educated, cisgender men.
Mm-hmm.
But I was in a diverse congregation. And so started reading like feminist theologies and womanist theologies and liberation theology and all this kind of stuff. And so that really shifted and changed my understanding of the divine as well. And it was around that time when I really, the open and relational stuff had always kind of been playing in the background for me, but that really started to come to the forefront when I was at that final church. And especially when I was kind of working with the spiritual director to discern stepping away from vocational ministry. I was looking, she was inviting me into more contemplative practices, and I was scared of God. I was like, why would I want to hang out with that dude? He sounds like an asshole. And so open and relational theology gave me an image and understanding of the divine who is love, that I can say that without having to cross my fingers, and kind of opened me up then to the more contemplative, the mystical type stuff, because I was like, yeah, I actually want to hang out with this God. And then the God that I found there within my contemplative practice is just that, a God of love. So that's kind of how it shifted.
What kind of contemplative practices helped you kind of navigate that? What was your spiritual director inviting you into practice-wise?
Yeah, she used a lot of like Ignatian spirituality type stuff. And I would do a lot of kind of like centering prayer. On my own, I found some breathwork type stuff. I got very interested in Zen Buddhism, specifically the work of someone like Thich Nhat Hanh. And so just some of these mindfulness practices and breath work was really helpful. But then also I did some like imaginative prayer with my spiritual director that I think those were some of the most powerful and impactful experiences I've had, were these imaginative prayer experiences. Guided by my spiritual director, but then also I had a really powerful one just by myself sitting on this floor that's behind me one day.
Do you mind talking about that experience, or is it too personal, private?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll share it. So I had been doing these, guided prayers, these imaginative prayers with my spiritual director, because I was having a really hard time accepting my new role as basically working in the beer world and not a pastor anymore. And so she would do these guided meditations with me where she invited me to place myself at, my place of work and look around and discover where Jesus is located and how Jesus is responding and active in these spaces. And Jesus, at the time I was just a bartender. I wasn't brewing yet. And the bar that I worked at has this big, beautiful circle bar where you have, your taps in the middle and you're kind of surrounded by the people. And for me, Jesus was always at the end of that, the circle, like right where you could kind of walk into, like where the bartenders would walk in, always laughing and having a good time and, buying everybody one last round before they leave kind of thing. And so I was having a hard time because I became the general manager at this establishment, and I was doing it for like 4 months. And a lot of the issues that I was having, a lot of the reasons I didn't like it, were similar to issues I had with being a pastor, which is a whole nother conversation.
Mhm.
And so I was like really, I don't know. I felt like my body was telling me like this isn't good and you should step away and this kind of thing. And so I wanted to pray about it. So I sat down. I have this. I'll be able to show you, but I know people won't be able to see it. But this like I call it my Buddha Jesus
No way.
statue.
That's Jesus sitting like classical Buddha.
Yeah.
And you got some
It's
prayer
beautiful.
beads around there? Is that a rosary?
It is a rosary. Yep. Yeah. So I have a rosary on there, but I sat that on the floor in front of me, just kind of as like a, I don't know, whatever. And I started to do like imaginative prayer. And what happened though was when I was looking around at the bar, Jesus wasn't sitting there at the bar where he normally was. And I looked around the room and I found Jesus actually at the door of the bar, kind of like, hey, it's time to go. Let's leave. But between Jesus and myself were these two people that there was some not great stuff that happened at that brewery. And so these two people needed forgiveness. And so before I was allowed to leave with Jesus, I had to forgive these two people. So I walked out from behind the bar, forgave each person, and then with Jesus left. And after that kind of prayer experience, I went downstairs and told my wife that I was resigning my position as general manager.
Wow.
And then I did that.
Wow.
And ultimately became a bartender there again just for a few weeks and then got pulled away and became a brewer. So
Wow. Yeah, those are like those prayer practices are ones that like they've been classically part of the faith, but whenever like evangelicalism, sprouted in the 1700s, it's like we were so separated from our spiritual roots that we never inherited those. And then you like have these prayer experiences and they're really mystical, they're really powerful, they're really transforming. And it's like, I don't know about you, but like when I had a couple of those experiences, I was mad. I was like, why did nobody tell me about this? Why didn't anybody ever teach me this kind of stuff? It's never even been a part of the conversation. And the answer was because they didn't know it existed or they just distrusted it because it wasn't, a cerebral understanding of doctrinal truths, whatever, facts and things. So now when you talk about open and relational theology, how would you describe open relational theology to like a middle schooler who is like, hey, what is that?
yeah, sure. So I'll just go, do the words. So theology is just like, talk about God. The open part in open and relational is actually making a claim about how time works, less about God. And so the idea of open is that the future is genuinely open, which, you could contrast this with something like Calvinism, right? Or determinism, where the story's already been written. Everything is set in stone. Everything's, predetermined by God, this kind of thing. So the future is set in that case. And I would even argue within a more Arminian approach, where people say we have free will, we can make our own choices, we make decisions. It's still pretty standard to teach that God knows the future. And I would argue that if God knows the future and knows it with certainty, that the future is set. Because there's no real possibility for us to do otherwise. Like if God knew that today I was going to wear this, full tilt shirt, I didn't really have a choice in the matter because God can't know things that are false. And so that's kind of the argument. And so the open part is saying, no, the future is genuinely open. You and I are invited to participate with the divine to write history together. So that's the open aspect. And then the relational aspect is making a claim about the divine, and it's to say that we genuinely have relationship with God, meaning that some things that are popular within classical theism get rejected by an open relational thinker. So the idea that God doesn't change is rejected, because if we have relationship, if I'm in relationship with you and you're in relationship with me, um, we should have impact on each other, right? You are now a different person because we've spent time talking together, in the same way I'm now a different person because we've spent time talking together. So it's relational. Or, they reject the idea that God can't suffer. Again, if you're my friend and you're experiencing something, sad or tragic, as your friend, I should have empathy for you. And also, that should make me sad, right? And so they want to say the same. Open and relational theology says the same is true of the divine, that we have the ability to impact God in the same way God can impact us, that God genuinely experiences our suffering and our pain, and also our joy and our happiness along with us. And so that's kind of the relational piece. God is in genuine relationship, not just with us, but with all of creation. And open, the future is open. So you can see how they kind of play nicely with each other.
Yeah, and this is like that understanding of God that like redeemed God for you. Like if you didn't run into open relational theology, where do you think you would have ended up at that juncture?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think I would still be a Christian if I didn't run into open and relational thinking, which I know could sound maybe extreme to some people, but I mean it genuinely. I probably would be just like a practicing Buddhist, which would be kind of cool, because I would consider myself like still deeply influenced, and maybe even a practitioner of, like Zen Buddhism. But that's not like the tradition that I'm mostly connected with. But I mean, like right here on my desk, there's a Buddha statue as well, right next to my Jesus statue. So probably that's where I would end up.
Yeah, a fun, one of my homeboys, I've never met him. Obviously, he died in 68 or 9, but Thomas Merton. And he was best friends with Thich Nhat Hanh. And he was conversing, I can't remember if it was Thich Nhat Hanh or the Dalai Lama, but he was conversing with an Eastern thinker. And he's like, man, I want to convert to your religion. And that person said, well, why don't you delve the depths of yours first? And then, and he says, and then I delved into the depths and it was enough. I'm also like a practicing Buddhist, because Buddhism isn't necessarily a religion. It's more of a philosophy with practices you do, because Buddha's not like a god or anything.
Right.
So I say that, like my home is the Christian faith, but I definitely have a garden shed out back of Buddhism in the back, because I practice meditation. I've been practicing like Zazen meditation for probably a decade now. And it's just like,
oh, cool.
A little while ago, I did a podcast about how my evangelical faith and upbringing like activated my nervous system all the time. It's like, God is after you, and God is like against you and mad at you, and the devil's out to get you, and the end is almost here, and the Antichrist might rise up. And if you don't have everything, it's like my religion was like, it totally activated my nervous system at all times. And then it told me that anything that would be experiential, like these prayer practices, you're talking about, those things are to be distrusted, because, Satan could come in and lie to you or manipulate your emotions. And so they gave me all of these things that activated my nervous system, and never gave me any practices to activate the parasympathetic nervous system that like chilled me out and calmed me down, because everything was, you're always on guard, you're always on edge, and God is always about to stomp you, and the devil's always about to deceive you, and the end is almost always here. And it's like, I realized how much damage that anxiety did to my physical body. And then I was like, there are these meditative practices out there that really help calm the nervous system down. And it's like, I never really put it together that my faith activated my nervous system and gave me trauma and all this other stuff without giving me tools to calm me down until most recently. And I'm like, man, well, that was a big part that was missing.
Yeah, absolutely. I very much had similar experiences. Yeah, the experience piece is interesting too, like being, taught not to trust your experience and all these kind of things. Which that's kind of, part of, I guess, why like the Buddhist meditation, but also the work of the mystics and stuff became so valuable to me.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, oh no, these people, like, I have this similar experience and like so do all these other people, and it's I don't know, that was helpful.
Yeah. Do you have a mystic that you were drawn to or a particular writing?
Yeah, so I mean, I read a lot of Thomas Merton. I read St. John of the Cross, St. Teresa of Avila. I'm trying to remember. Anthony de Mello. I don't know if he would call himself a mystic, but I really enjoyed Anthony's work a lot.
Yeah.
What's his name? Last name Laird. I forget his first name. But I've enjoyed a lot of his work. I don't know. I've kind of read all over with the mystics, and yeah, and even just like in conversations like this with other people who have had, cool experiences.
Yeah. I got my doctorate and my master's in spiritual formation.
Oh, cool.
And it was like, I don't know, there's growing up in the evangelical church, you got this discipleship piece, like, I just want to fill your head with knowledge and give you skills to help us do our church better. And like, that was that was the expanse of discipleship. And then I ran into Richard Foster's work, Celebration of the Disciplines. Mm-hmm. And he's like, you can actually cultivate virtue in your life by doing these practices. And I was like, no way. I didn't know you could do that. But then, I had this draw to like Merton, and I'm like, how does he fit in there? And I talked to other formation minded people, and they never like figured out the contemplation piece, the mystical piece. Mm-hmm. There was, so I've learned that there's like these three different aspects of, the faith. We got the, we got the discipleship piece, because skills and knowledge are good to have. You're looking for a job, you're going to need skills and knowledge for that. It's like, right, that's good. Right. That's not everything. And then, cultivating virtue, that's good. But then there's like this knowing beyond words and experience beyond, being able to describe it. That is the mystical contemplative tradition. And that one is just like, oh, they're all of these different branches were like missing this contemplative piece that's still out there. That Thomas Merton was my connector piece for that one. He's been good. Have you read hold on, I'll pull it up. I got a Spiritual Direction and Meditation. I
have not read that by him. I have not.
He wrote these like tiny little books. I have this one too, Opening the Bible. He wrote it for Time magazine.
Oh, cool. Okay.
That's a good one. But yeah, he wrote these like little tiny ones. Look how thin they are. Like, that's teeny.
Yeah, nice.
And it's a little one. But this like blew my mind open. I was like, meditation is Christian? You can do that? And it's like, wow. But yeah, those are two of my favorite little ones that I've been diving into. You got a Merton work that like
nice
affected you?
I just took a note. Huh?
Do you got a Merton work that affected you?
I mean, I think the first one that I read was New Seeds of Contemplation, which I really enjoyed. And then there's the Thomas Merton prayer. Let me pull it up real quick. I've used it. I have
no idea where I'm going.
Yes, exactly.
The Merton prayer. It's one of my favorites.
Yes, I still use it all the time. It was introduced to me by my spiritual director. Is it cool? Do you care if I read it?
Oh, you're going to read Merton here on this one? Absolutely.
Yeah. Sorry. Here's the Merton prayer that still resonates with me deeply. My Lord God, I have no idea where I am going. I do not see the road ahead of me. I cannot know for certain where it will end, nor do I really know myself. And the fact that I think I'm following your will does not mean that I'm actually doing so. But I believe the desire to please you does in fact please you. And I hope I have that desire in all that I am doing. I hope that I will never do anything apart from that desire. And I know that if I do this, you will lead me by the right road, though I may know nothing about it. Therefore will I trust you always, though I may seem to be lost and in the shadow of death. I will not fear, for you are ever with me, and you will never leave me to face my perils alone. It's like, boom. I love that prayer.
I know. I mean, it was just like you gave my mind and my heart a shot of bourbon. I was just like, Merton is just, yeah, he's so rich that way, where he has that prayer. I have this one book. I don't know if I have it here. I think I left it at home. It's called The Book of Hours, and it is a Thomas Merton devotion. It's like not really a devotional, because that's a really evangelical term. It's like you keep the hours, the prayer hours, like monks do.
Okay.
But instead of classical prayers from the Book of Common Prayer and Psalms from the Book of Psalms, it's all Merton writings. And it walks you through an entire week where it's just all Merton poetry, Merton songs, Merton readings, contemplations. And that book, I think that book saved my faith at a time of crisis. It says I was at a church that was imploding upon itself, and there was so much anger and there was so much resentment, and it was really nasty. And then I stuck with that church through an interim period, and then when they reformed, they were like this Baptist version of the thing that I used to love, and I was like, I don't know what this is anymore. And when they kicked women out of leadership, then I left. And that was probably 3 years from start to end I burned out. I'm 6'5", so I'm a fairly tall guy, but I got down to about 155 pounds, and I was I just wasted away to nothing. And that book, I would just wake up every morning and I would grab that book, and I think it definitely saved a version of the faith in me, because I would have just walked away from it all, I think, because what I saw in the people who claimed to be Christian in that moment was anything but. It was just like, wow, I didn't know people who claimed to follow this God that is love could be so spiteful, angry, hateful. It was just a really hard time. And I think Thomas Merton that's where I really latched onto Merton, is he's like my patron saint. It's like, this is my homeboy right here. And I've loved him ever since.
Yeah, that's so beautiful. The mystics, absolutely, earlier when I was talking about open and relational theology is kind of the thing that saved my faith. I mean that wholeheartedly, but what it also did, though, was, and I think I already said this, but it gave me permission, so to speak, to kind of step into those contemplative spaces and read people like the mystics. And so I've actually, a lot of what I try to do is bring together open relational or process thinking, because I'm a process person, and mysticism, because I think they go really nicely together. And so I'm all here for the mystics and the contemplatives and absolutely.
Yeah, they give you hope. Well,
big time.
We've both had some church hurt in our past, and then the mystics have saved us. So
yes.
What were you going to say? I interrupted something you were about to say. I'd like to hear that.
Yeah, I was just going to say what I like about the mystics is that they never sugarcoated anything. So they were very realistic about bad experiences or evil or whatever. Yeah. And so I felt like I could relate to them because they were honest about their experiences and all this kind of stuff. And still, continued to seek relationship and union with the divine. And I was like, oh, well, if they did it, then maybe I can do it too.
Yeah, you read John of the Cross and you realize he wasn't just a really good poet that, then wrote commentary on his poetry, which is really interesting. He writes the poems as the thing, And then he writes commentary so you can understand what the poem means. But his work, Ascent of Mount Carmel, was pretty influential for me. But you realize, like, this guy spent like 5 years in a dungeon being starved to death because he held to this mystical understanding of God, and they didn't like it, and so they threw him in prison. And then he breaks out of prison and goes and joins up with that was Teresa of Avila, I think. And like they start a reform, like this Carmelite reform of the Catholic Church, like right alongside of the timeline of like Martin Luther's doing his reforms. And it's like you understand, like, yeah, these guys didn't candy coat life. They don't have this toxic positivity that is like covered in like in the church today, where everything has to be smiley, happy people holding hands, to quote REM. And it's like, it's like they really bring the substance of faith to the reality of life. They don't use theology as an insulator to life. We're like, we'll protect you from how bad everything is with these happy thoughts. It's like, you can't be protected from the bad. It's going to happen. And the mystics, they like give you like these tools to like, just look at it. It's like, yeah, look at this ugly thing that's suffering in, hardship in life. And here's how that can actually fit into your faith story. And you could do something with that. And it's like, yeah, John of the Cross, he's like writing from a dungeon. It's like, man, how could you write such beautiful poetry from such a dark place? But yeah, mystics can do that, man.
Yeah, and the mystics are the ones that taught me not to back away from or ignore or run away from or overlook the darkness, but rather to press into the darkness. And that there's actually this wisdom that comes from going in all the way, right? Like Rob Bell has this bit where he talks about cynical people don't go far enough. They just kind of dip their toe into the darkness, right?
Yeah.
But it's the mystics who know, like, oh no, he makes this joke when people are being cynical. He's like, oh no, it's way worse than that. We're all going to die. And so the mystics know that. The mystics don't just dip their toe in, to the pool of cynicism, but rather go all the way into the darkness. And there's a wisdom that comes after, being willing to step into those dark places and going through.
Yeah.
And so that's, I think, one of the biggest lessons I've learned from them. And kind of connected to that, or at least it's connected in my mind, one line that really sticks with me and has stuck with me ever since I heard it is attributed to Saint Teresa. And she said something along the lines of, if I am ever to become a saint, I shall be a saint of darkness. For it's not in heaven that I'll be found, but outside with a light pointing the way. And I was like, yes, that.
Yeah, mystics have room for that, but then like pop evangelical modern churchy stuff they don't have room for that, because we don't want to like look at that. I love that Rob Bell quote about cynicism. They don't go far enough. It reminded me of a Merton quote where he says, like, if you really want to understand hope, then you have to understand how much like despair hope is. Because to hope is to not have, but yet to keep, like, I've exited the Merton quote just for the record, but like to hope for something is to not have it. To despair over something is to not have it. But the difference is you're keeping your eye on the horizon from where you know the sun will rise. And it's like that's the hope piece. And I love how cynicism just doesn't go far enough. You're like, if you want to arrive at hope, push yourself through your cynicism and say, yeah, it's much worse than this, and then arrive on the other side of despair to find what hope really is. And instead, we're like, just swap out hope for like optimism. You're like, yeah, I really hope that this happens. It's like, no, that's not what hope is. Hope is much worse than that.
Yeah. Nice. I like it.
Yeah, that was good. I had not heard Rob Bell. I talked with him on the podcast a little while ago over the spaceship book that he wrote. That was a really good book. I was really surprised because I had not read something like that from him before. And I'm like, wait, I'm reading science fiction and I'm reading Rob Bell, but it's not Rob Bell and it's not science fiction. And it's like, that was a really interesting book, but it's about grief and stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. It was an interesting book. I read it as well. And had a fun conversation with him. Yeah, it was interesting. I like how you phrased it. It wasn't quite Rob Bell, but it also wasn't just science fiction either. But it was like, I don't know. I felt like I found Rob in the pages. Like I knew because I've read Rob's work before. I was like, oh, this is Rob, but also this is a different side of Rob.
It was
or
totally
a different expression. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we both have some church hurt, and we both have, we've done through some theological evolution. If you're honest, if you're humble, and if you're open, where could the church go in the next decade if you're thinking hope-wise?
Yeah. Well, hope-wise, I mean, I think the potential for the church to be a genuine place of belonging and acceptance and love and a positive impact in the world that genuinely seeks to help other people with, no strings attached kind of thing. That's kind of where, I could see it going. I think the church could genuinely be a voice of peace if they are open to other traditions and people that look different than them in a way that isn't just like, oh, well, let me go talk to this Muslim guy and, hear what he has to say, but really I'm secretly trying to convert him, but rather from a place of humility, seeking mutual transformation, where somehow the church is now different because these other voices have been invited to be a part of it. And so I think that, the church could be a catalyst for peace as well. And where I get really excited, because I have a hard time going to church. I don't really go to church anymore. I work for one, but I don't really attend. And the closest thing that I get every year is going to this event called Theology Beer Camp.
Oh, by Trip Fuller?
Yeah, Trip puts it on, Trip Fuller and Homebrewed Christianity. And it's a beautiful expression of the Christian faith. It makes me want to be a Christian. To go there and hear a diverse voice of speakers and be present with a diverse group of people, all the way from active clergy members to, atheists who have been so hurt by the church that, they don't really want anything to do with it, but some reason they come and hang out at Theology Beer Camp. It's such a beautiful expression of, I guess to use Christian language, the kingdom of God, where there's a range of like age groups, socioeconomic status. It doesn't have this air of the speakers are somehow better than everyone else, but rather everybody's there together. Like the theologians and scholars are out and about. There's no secret green room where everyone hangs out. And so it's kind of this, we're all in it together. We're all belong. We're all in this journey, together, and everyone's welcome. And I think that vision is inspiring.
Yeah, there's not a demand for uniformity that you tend to see in a lot of churches, because, man, if you look at like most church doctrinal statements, the one on their website is not the one in their bylaws. If you've ever noticed,
right.
Like the one on their website is like, this is the one we're going to tell everyone we believe. And then it's like, but we need to legally say we believe all of these things. And then you get a 5-page document, and it's like, oh, they're welcoming and they have modern music and it's all great. And then it's like, wait, but they don't allow women or LGBTQ members to become members or to teach or to, it's like, oh yeah, well that's in, bylaw X of, line number 34. And it's like, well, that's not on the website. It's like, there's something about that. What's really interesting about the church I'm in is we're in a congregational church, and we're not creedal, we're covenantal. And so
Okay.
we have 7 sentences, and it's like, and your conscience gets to interpret those how your conscience does. And you hold those beliefs in covenant and in community and in relationship with us. And it's like, wait, so you just hand me 7 simple sentences. I have the freedom of conscience to interpret these how I believe the Spirit is inspiring me to interpret those. And then I hold them nonviolently in community with people who might be interpreting things differently than me. And it's like, I think that actually might work for going forward.
Yeah.
Instead of demanding uniformity, like, let's embrace the diversity of this, but do it in a way that is loving and embracing and inclusive of other viewpoints out there.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that. And I mean, I think too, one more thing I'll harp on with the beer camp stuff, but I think it's because they're hitting on something important, is I think the church needs to continue centering and platforming, whatever language you want to use, voices from the margins. The people, like people that look like you and I have been writing theology and telling people what to believe for a very long time. And the body of Christ is much more diverse, thank God, than, white men, whatever. And at beer camp last year, there was this really beautiful closing, kind of spur of the moment, Eucharist ceremony, where the entire Eucharist ceremony was led by members of the LGBTQ community. From the people serving, the person who presided over the elements, the people leading music, the whole thing. And it was a deeply moving experience to have a group of people who traditionally have been marginalized and pushed out and told that they don't belong, willing to still serve communion. And, it was crazy. I mean, talking to friends about that experience afterwards, there's people who hadn't taken communion in years, and were so moved by the experience that they did it. One friend of mine, forgive the language, but she, also a former pastor, when she was experiencing this communion bit, she turned around to her friend and said, "Oh, fuck, I'm still a Christian." So it was a deeply powerful and moving experience.
Wow.
So yeah, I think, that's a hopeful vision, that I can get on board with as well.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, that one thing I've been made aware of in recent years about listening to the people on the margins is how much my faith spiritualized things. Like we take this problem of sin, and instead of the social implications of what it means in society, what sin is, it's just your personal original sin that you need to repent of and have some kind of a forgiveness of God. It never seemed to stick when I was 8. I was always praying that prayer over and over again, like, oh crap, I must have not done it right. I need to do it again. I need to do it again. It's because we've spiritualized everything. We spiritualized, the crucifixion moment. And then I read James Cone theology, or the Jesus and the cross and the lynching tree.
Cross and the lynching tree, yeah.
And I was like, oh my gosh, I've never, ever seen this, because my evangelical tradition was not an oppressed tradition. It was the mainline tradition of the faith. And so we didn't need all of Jesus's sayings about social things. And so we instead spiritualized them so that they made sense to us in positions of privilege and power. And then you get into I grew up near Detroit. So I had this inner city black man as a teacher for my, for one of my theology classes. And, he was getting up there about how he's voting Democrat. And I was like, wait, you can do that as a Christian? Like, that's how white conservative Christian I grew up. Fundamentalist is that being a Republican and a Christian was the same thing. And I'm like, you can't do that. What about abortion? What about, and I had this list of no, I'm a one issue voter. And it was just so weird. And now I realize I've been spiritualizing all of these things and turning them to make them applicable to me. But you get someone on the margins, they're like, no, that's not spiritual. That has actually everyday implications for me and my people. And it's like, wow. now my understanding of that theology is totally different because I have a role to play with the privilege that I do have to help alleviate those things. It's not just a spiritual problem that Jesus magically fixes with like fairy dust, but like, wow, that's a social, like systemic racism is a thing. And it's like, we need to figure out how to make this better. It's like, that's something that talking to people on the margins has helped me see. It's just how spiritual I've made everything, and then it doesn't really work for life. And I don't know. I think that part is like fading away in church a lot. Obviously, there's still people that hold to that really hard, but the rising of the spiritual nuns, N-O-N-Es, in our society is telling us something, and we're not listening. And I think, yeah, as you say, we need to humble ourselves and listen to these people. And they have a lot to teach us. And that's what I want to do on this podcast is like, I need to know this stuff. I need help seeing it and learning it.
You got me thinking. I'm working on my master's thesis right now, and I'm actually studying religious pluralism and the nuns. And one thing that I'm finding helpful, and you just said it, which is affirming to me, is that I'm in my thesis, I'm viewing the nuns essentially as another religious tradition. And then using the language of like a deep religious pluralism, one that, it's not, it's pluralism without like relativizing everything. So it still recognizes that each tradition is unique, that it's special. From like a soteriological perspective, they're probably up to different things, all of this kind of stuff. But looking at the nuns similarly, and asking what can we learn from them? How can their presence bring about mutual transformation? All this kind of stuff. So I was glad to hear you say that, because it kind of gave me a little bit of affirmation for the thesis I'm working on.
Yeah.
But also too, just quickly to your point about from the margins, because I think one of the biggest gifts that like liberation theology type stuff has given to me is exactly what you were hitting on when it comes to something like sin. Because for me growing up, sin was always this hyper individual thing. Like, Josh, you did a bad thing and now you need forgiveness from God. And what's interesting about that is that really sounds like a theology written by people in the position of power.
Yes.
Because if you're oppressing groups of people, you have to have some conscious knowing that this isn't great. So what do? Oh, of course, let's make a theology that says when I do bad things, God's going to forgive me. But if within liberation theology, someone take like Andrew Sung Park, who's a Korean theologian that I really like, talks about the sinned against, that the gospel has to be good news, not just for the sinners, but those who are sinned against. And so it's this more holistic understanding, and that tied with, some like more common language in like liberation theology of how salvation isn't this individual thing, but rather it's communal. Think about like the Exodus story, right?
Oh yeah.
That's a communal event, a communal experience. And so for me, what it's taught me is my salvation is deeply wrapped up with yours and with my neighbors. And I'll push even further and saying with all of creation. And so until all of us are saved, none of us are saved. That's kind of the, the way that I'd want to say that. But that's a gift that I've picked up from the margins.
You reminded me of a quote from Lila Watson, and she was, I can't remember, I think it was in Brazil, but there was all these missionaries, like, white missionaries that come to Brazil to like help and, help all the people with the white people. We're going to go help them with our money and our power and things. And Lila Watson gets up and she's like given the opening bit. And she just is one of my favorite quotes. She says, "If you've come here to help me, you are wasting your time. But if your salvation is wrapped up in mine, then let's work together." I was like, boom, my brain just exploded. That's a good, your quotes just made me think of that one. And I've used that one a couple of times. It's like, wow. Yeah. Cause when we spiritualize things and make it about individual stuff, then it's like, well, who wrote all those things that we are supposed to do and not do? It was like, oh, it's the Bible. But there's interpretations of the Bible, and there's emphases that people put on interpretations of what's in the Bible. And the people on the margins aren't the ones who got to do the interpretations or put the emphases on them. And it's like, yeah, these are, when I was listening to Three Black Men podcast, and they said that the doctrine of inerrancy is the doctrine of white supremacy. I was like, wait a second, say more. And and they started to describe how it's like these theo bros are all white online, and they're like, oh yeah, you can have your black theology, but it needs to conform to my white theology first. I was like, wow, I've never seen that. And it's just like, you don't see this stuff if you're just in your camp doing your thing with your bros. Like, you have to listen to these voices that we've pushed to the margins. And yeah, I'm learning so much through this podcast and these conversations I get to have. It's like, wow, I've never seen this. I've never experienced that. Yeah, I love it.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
Back to my question. If we are not humble, honest, and open as a collective church, where do you think it heads in the next decade?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, I'm going to be a bit cynical here and go against what I was
Oh, it's worse than that.
earlier.
It's worse than that.
It's worse than that. We're all going to die. Yeah, I don't know. Like, unfortunately for me, I don't see, like, I think there's a massive crisis with like the whole Christian nationalism thing that's happening right now. I don't see that going away.
Yeah.
And so the negative side of me is, if we aren't open, if we aren't humble, doing these things, then we let those people win. And like,
oh, man,
that's kind of harsh to say, because I don't want to other them as like those people.
Right.
But and maybe I can rephrase that and say, we let those ideas win out. Because I'm more interested in attacking ideas than people.
Right.
I don't want to dehumanize others, but yeah, I think that version, that expression of the Christian faith continues to be the one, the thing that people think of when they think Christian. And I don't want that to happen. I mean, sometimes I do, right? Sometimes when I'm very, pessimistic, I'm like, yeah, screw it. Let the church go to hell, so to speak. But on days when I'm, positive and having conversations like this, or hanging out with my friends who make me still want to be Christian, then I'm like, yeah, I don't want those voices, those ideas to continue to co-opt the church and to say this is what it means to be Christian, and promote hatred and bigotry and violence and all this kind of stuff. So I think if we aren't open, if we're not humble, those voices are going to continue to be loud. They're going to continue to grow, and that's going to be what Christianity becomes. And I don't want to see that happen.
Yeah. Do you, we watch It's a Wonderful Life every year at Christmas time. It's one of my favorite movies ever because I love Jimmy Stewart. But there's this line, it's not really a line, but it's like a concept where you have this, Mr. Potter, he owns everything in town except this small little rundown Bailey's building and loan. And he's the one that helps people get into houses that are affordable and they're not dumps. And he gives people loans and he helps all these families like really establish themselves and have dignity and humanity in their living and in their housing. And he does it through this small little building and loan company. Whereas Mr. Potter, he's the rich guy. He owns everything in town. He has slums and he oppresses people with his riches and his money. And there's this line where, they're arguing on whether or not they should shut down the small little rinky-dink building and loan. And George Bailey is like, you need to keep this place open if it's just because it keeps people from running to him. And he points to Mr. Potter. And it's like, gosh, yes, we need these small expressions of the church that is they're just doing it well. They're doing it better than these loud voices that are co-opting everything and using it for their own personal gains, so that they're, at least when people are either wounded by that expression or they just look at it and say, oh, nope, never. They need something, even if it's just a little rinky-dink podcast like you or me, that they can go to and listen and say, wait, that's not it. There's something different. There's something more. Yeah, I think what we're doing and what we're saying is very valuable in this world, even if it never becomes as big as that whole Christian nationalism shit show that's out there. But
yeah, podcasting is an act of resistance. How's that?
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, I love your voice. I love what you're doing. I love who you're talking to. It's like, sometimes it's like, who should I have on my show? Let me go see who Josh has had on his show. We're like, oh, there's some ideas. So just, thank you for your voice and your work and what you're doing. And how can folks connect with you and your work? What's the best place to find you?
Yeah, sure. So my podcast is called Rethinking Faith. You can find me on Instagram, Rethinking Faith. Also, it's new. I've only posted a few videos, but I have some stuff on TikTok as well for people who are into that. And then you can you can find Rethinking Faith anywhere you listen to podcasts. So just search it up, and there's hopefully something there for everybody. And then I guess also too, if you want to connect, you can either DM me through the Instagram page or email me at rethinkingfaithpod@gmail.com.
All right, I'll make sure that gets in the notes, and I'll make it so that bots can't find you. So,
oh yeah,
those bots are everywhere. Well, Josh, thank you so much for coming on the Liminal Living podcast. I really enjoyed our conversation today.
Yeah, this was a lot of fun. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. Well, thank you for listening to the Liminal Living podcast. If this has been helpful, I would ask that you hit the subscribe button, a like button, a share button, wherever you're listening and however they let you interact with this podcast. Boost our algorithms by doing something with it. It also help us if you left a rating and a review wherever you're listening to this podcast. That helps people find us. And if you found this specific episode very helpful, you can share it with somebody who you think it might benefit them as well. So next week, we will see you for another conversation with theologian Pastor Trey Ferguson, who wrote this wonderful book called Theologizing Bigger. And my conversation with him is up next week. So we will see you then. Happy liminal space traversing, my friends.